Good morning. My name is Stephen. I have the privilege of serving as pastor here. I get to lead our staff in session. Just a little bit of housekeeping before I get started this morning. Next Sunday, as mentioned, we're going to have an installation service for Lance, which we are very excited about. But before that, in the first service, we are going to say goodbye to one of our member of our community who's been here for a while, but is moving to Texas to be closer to her son. So we're going to say goodbye to Paula. So make sure you are here next week and we can say goodbye to her. Yeah, you hear those awes, Paula? I know. You do hear that. I told in the first service, it might involve giving you a microphone, so we're going to see what happens. So watch out for that. Journalist Sebastian Junger opens his book Tribe by describing this remarkable phenomena that took place in early colonial American history. While indigenous tribes were living broadly egalitarian communal lives in nomadic encampments, at the same time, industrialization was completely changing the landscape up and down the East Coast with factories and these new urban centers. And the proximity of these two cultures living in near constant warfare over centuries presented a very stark contrast about how to live. Maybe it says something about human nature that a surprising number of Americans, mostly men, when presented with that contrast, opted to cut ties with Western European life and leave the city to join the indigenous tribes out in the forests of the East Coast. And it happened frequently enough to draw the attention of some of the best thinkers and writers of the day who were utterly puzzled as to how people could turn their back on their own society. No less than Benjamin Franklin in 1753 wrote a letter describing how, in spite of all the best efforts to educate and westernize indigenous children, that whenever those children had the opportunity to go back and visit with a family member, the children would leave and never return. But then on the other hand, when captured Americans were liberated from their captivity to these native tribes, they were almost impossible to keep home. He writes this: though ransomed by their friends, and this is describing those European colonists who had come and been captured, though ransomed by their friends and treated with all imaginable tenderness to prevail with them to stay among the English, yet in a short time they became disgusted with our manner of life, and take the first good opportunity of escaping again into the woods. And the thing is, the opposite almost never happened. Native Americans almost never broke the bonds with their tribes to join in with Anglo society. No one left the tribal life to choose the city. Immigration was a one-way street. The French immigrant Hector de Crevecoeur lamented in 1782, forgive the non-PC language at the time, thousands of Europeans are Indians, and we have no examples of even one of those Aborigines having from choice become European. There must be in their social bond something singularly captivating and far superior to anything to be boasted of among us. So something about the nature and the quality of life among the peoples of the First Nations was more appealing than anything that these new colonies had to offer. When people disappeared into the tree line, they found a strong community with very clear social roles. They found a common story. They found shared rhythms of life. And all of that was a balm to the busyness, to the alienation of modern life. So here you have a group of people who had been living without microphones and just getting along just fine without them. But they lived in this way that was essentially unchanged for thousands of years. And then you have, on the other hand, these people who were supposedly at the apex of civilization from a scientific, technological, medical standpoint. But the traffic only went one way, not to the city, but away from it. And it reminded me a little bit of Thoreau's experiment in the woods, where he stepped away from the quiet desperation of a hurried life so that he could live deliberately. And Junger's point is that in spite of all the, this technological, governmental, medical, scientific, progress that we have, and all that stuff's great. He's no Luddite. He's a journalist. It's better to have those things than not. But it's worth asking the question of whether the pace of modern society has produced something a bit ruinous to the soul. And I would argue that that question is maybe a little bit more pressing now than it was in the 1800s. We're actually living at a pretty key inflection point in human history. Past century and a half has brought us these technological advances that have improved human life in many ways, very true. But more and more scholars are cautioning us also about the dehumanizing effects and the excessive use of digital media and smartphones as those things displace analog communications and in-person relationships. And we are seeing that we're getting lonelier and more alienated, while simultaneously being more and more aware of the ways that we are falling behind our peers, because we see pictures of it all the time. Jean Twenge made waves with her 2017 Atlantic article titled, "Have Smartphones Ruined a Generation?" And she's a psychologist who studies the difference between generations, and she pointed to 2012 as this key inflection point between millennials and Gen Z. And in that year, all sorts of mental health indicators spike, including loneliness, anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, and a lot more ominous ones than that. I recently finished Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation. I recommend it, particularly if you are the parent of teenagers. And he notes the same thing. So what was it about 2012 that made this clear line of demarcation? Well, they note that that was the year that the number of Americans who had smartphones surpassed 50% of the population. And since then, rates of mental illness have continued to skyrocket. And so I have to wonder if, like, generations to come will look back on the way that Twitter and TikTok and Instagram and like our news apps and all that stuff, and the way that they have consumed our attention and hooked us. I wonder if they'll look on us the way that we looked back on people in the 1960s, just like chain smoking through every room that they were in. At the same time, sociologists have noted that the decline in empathy has been on the rise in the last decade, and they surmise that the disintegration of social life is a big part of that. We no longer engage in those face-to-face conversations where we can be vulnerable, where we can be present, where we can encounter people with different points of view. And that shift has been, given underway by a series of gradual steps and moves away from those interpersonal relationships and onto communities that are increasingly online and these digital opinion enclaves or digital tribes. So we no longer walk into the woods to find an alternative community. We go online. But the problem with those is that those communities are often governed by antagonism and grievance instead of a positive vision of what it looks like to flourish. But the thing is, if you're lonely and you're alienated, a digital tribe is better than no tribe at all. Similarly, the church is dangerously close to becoming colonized by all kinds of cultural and political agendas around us. In conversations that I have with people, pastors, secular oriented neighbors, on the political right, political left, one thing is in common, that everybody's kind of like, what's going on with the church? And I'm like, I don't. I just work here. I don't know. But we're becoming enthralled to these values of a post-Christian culture that has a very different vision of the good than the one outlined by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. And I don't mean that in an antagonistic, fight, culture war kind of way. I just mean that as an honest observation. And the thing is, when you walk into this community, you ought to be walking into a very different way of life, a different sort of ecosystem. You should be in a different place than the culture around you. In his letter to the Corinthians, Paul describes the church and our role in the culture as that of ambassadors. That's our role in the world. And if you walk into an American embassy, whether you are in Kenya or Japan or Qatar, the way of doing things there ought to remind you of home, even though you are in a different host country. Jesus called his disciples a city on a hill, like a community within a community, a culture, a counterculture within the broader society. He called them an embassy of heaven, a place where you can step into it and experience an entirely different way of being in the world. So what is the path forward in our particular cultural moment? Well, over the last 7 weeks, we have described it as a community committed to abiding in Jesus through the creation of a rule of life. And that's something that we've described simply as an ordered set of practices, relational rhythms, and commitments guided by the Holy Spirit, through which we live in alignment with our deepest desire for God's deepest transformation. It's a way of saying we need a trellis to abide on the vine. And so with that, we can only end this series in one place. If you have your Bibles, I invite you to open them to John chapter 15. And before I read the scripture, I want to invite you to just take a deep breath and pause with this simple prayer. Speak, Lord, your people are listening. Jesus says, I am the vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine. You are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Now, remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends. For everything that I learned from my Father, I have made known to you. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Notice how many times Jesus says the word remain, or some translations say abide, in this short passage. He says it in 2 paragraphs 10 times, which, is kind of a way of saying pay attention to this. And the word is meno in Greek. It has this connotation of to make your home in something, to dwell in something, and then live out of that place. And it's this well-known image. It comes from Jesus in his last bit of communication, gathering his disciples together before the night that he is betrayed, crucified, And his final word is to make our home in him, to anchor our minds and our hearts and our awareness in him, to index our hearts toward the reality of the kingdom that he is bringing into the world. And that, Jesus says, is how we will bear fruit. And so his model of spiritual formation is very simple. The way that we grow in his likeness, the way that we experience the joy of his, the fruit of love and peace, the way that we become a non-anxious presence in our cities, in our neighborhoods, in our homes, in our schools, the way that we grow into people of grace and mercy is through making our home with him. It's to abide. I am the one in whom you will find life, Jesus says. And so it poses just a very basic question for all of us. And that's, where are you finding your life? Where are you drawing your life from? Whatever you ground your life in, whatever you abide in, is the most determining factor about who you become. If you believe, for instance, that career success is the most true thing about you, your ultimate purpose, then you're going to express that belief through certain behaviors and actions and priorities and practices aimed at your ambition. If, on the other hand, you believe that a sense of fun and adventure is going to be a part of what's deeply satisfying, of ultimate purpose for you, then you're going to express that belief through all kinds of different beliefs and practices. If you believe that meaning is going to come from being a Philadelphia Eagles fan, then yeah, exactly. This is what will happen. You will put your hands over your head a lot of times. But Jesus claims that to have this satisfying, full, abundant life, the pathway to that is to remain in him. Where you think you're going to find your life, that's what determines everything else, and it aims and it reorders your life. It determines where you're going to abide. Now, I hear that and I think, cool, great, abide, got it. What does that mean? Well, I've got deadlines. I've got episodes of The Bear to catch up on. I've got kids with 17,000 different activities each week. I've got all the perils of modern life. I've got urban, noise and all the things. Whatever it is that is in your life, how do we slow down enough to where we can abide with Jesus? And disciples of Jesus have been asking this question for a very, very long time. And as the church formed around Jesus' life and his teaching, that pathway was described in two technical sounding but important terms. And the terms were orthodoxy and orthopraxy. Orthodoxy, which we are more familiar with, means right worship. It's about what we glorify and what we hold up, being committed to the truth of Jesus, what he said about himself, about his life in the triune God. It's about taking on Jesus' mental model of the world. You could call this the rule of faith. And if you go onto any sort of church website all throughout the world, chances are you will see something on there about a statement of faith, about what we hold to be true. So that's orthodoxy, the rule of faith. Orthopraxy, on the other hand, which is a word that's kind of disappeared from most of the church's lexicon. It refers to how we live out or practice the way of Jesus in the world. You could think of that as the rule of life. It's how we embody what it is that we believe. How do we take that, what we believe, and hold that with a posture and actions and carry that out into the world? And you would think that holding these two things, a rule of faith and a rule of life together, would just be common sense. But history actually tells us a very different story on that. Most of the fights throughout the history of the church have been over doctrine, been over the rule of faith. Almost nobody is fighting over being generous to the poor. 2015 people are not doing it, don't get me wrong, but we're not fighting about it. 2015 Barna study on the state of discipleship in church has revealed this common assumption that simply gaining biblical or theological knowledge will produce spiritual maturity. That's what most people in the pews thought. And don't get me wrong, while knowledge is certainly important, knowledge alone does not produce a mature or strong faith. You've likely encountered somebody who has demonstrated this fact, right? You know somebody who knows a lot about God. They're willing to talk to you about it, about what they know. In fact, they're willing to correct the entire internet if they have to. And they do this in ways that are unkind, uncharitable, and whose life, if they have the right beliefs, their behavior does not actually match the beliefs that they have. It doesn't make a dent in it. And here's the thing. Jesus is not calling us just to believe in his teachings. He does say, "Let my word abide in you." But he also calls his disciples in this very passage to do what he commands, principally to love one another. It's this marriage of belief and practice. Because as a whole, we are whole beings. We are not just minds. Spiritual formation requires knowledge to be translated into action if it's going to be effective. So yeah, it's one thing to know that the key to physical health is like some combination of diet and sleep and exercise. It is another thing altogether to put down the Cheeto bag, lace up your sneakers, and go to bed at a reasonable hour. So this idea that the rule of faith is all that matters, if that came around and it's still kind of hanging on in the life of the church, and it didn't come from Jesus, then where did it come from? Well, in a little book called Spiritual Theology, theologian Diogenes Allen notes that spirituality and theology weren't considered separate disciplines until the 13th century. And I knew Diogenes Allen, and I have a feeling that like anytime you name your child Diogenes, like you're limiting their career options. He had to be a theologian. But he writes, today we often describe spirituality as like the experiential relationship with God. It's what we've come to know about God through our experience with Him. But theology we think of as the intellectual pursuit of God. But in the first millennia and a half of the church's history, this was a completely false separation. To know God was to experience God. To experience God was to seek out ways of knowing God even more. During the Enlightenment of the 16th and 17th centuries that caused this significant decline in the embodied practices of Jesus within the global church. And the rise of scientific rationalism, a division between spirituality and theology began to emerge, allowing people to divorce the truth of Jesus from the way of Jesus as though one could attain the life of Jesus without actually doing what he said. Allen goes on to write, justification and sanctification are twins. They are both the work of Christ, but each is a distinct work. Justification is our forgiveness or our pardon by God apart from the law because of Christ's death on the cross. Sanctification is the process by which we actually begin to become holy, free of the effects of evil, and full of charity or divine love. Justification is the beginning of sanctification. Both require divine grace. Divine grace does not mean that there's nothing left for us to do. Quite the contrary. It is precisely because of divine grace that we are able to begin to seek freedom from the effects of sin and evil and to begin to love in the way Christ loves. So life is more than just an interlude between when we come to faith and when we die. Life is actually the place where we practice. It is the tumbling ground for life in the age to come. And so these earliest Christians, they were known as followers of the way because they were primarily known for their countercultural lifestyle, that they practiced their faith in a way that mirrored their belief in a God who died and who rose from the dead, who sent his Spirit into the world to make a church as a community in that world, to be this little outpost of heaven wherever they were. And so the equation that Jesus seems to be putting forth is that abiding in him and in his way, plus the truth of what he commanded, equals the life that he is able to make available to us. Which is why Paul says to Timothy, watch your life and doctrine closely, not one or the other. Persevere in them, because if you do, you will save both yourself and your hearers. So how do we hold these two things together? Not just allegiance to Jesus' truth claims, but ordering our lives in such a way that we actually begin to look like him. Well, to end with where we began, we need a trellis. We need a structure to help us remain connected to the vine. So over the last 4 years that I've been here, we have gone through 6 practices that we see in the life of Jesus. We've done kind of like a 1-week version of those over the last 6 weeks. And in the years to come, we're going to go through 5 more to help root us in him, to help produce the kind of fruit that our world desperately needs if it's going to know God, if it's going to see the flourishing of the kingdom break into the world the way that he imagines. But the truth is, even though we've covered all these practices, anything, just about anything, can become a spiritual practice. It can be Bible reading or a restful Saturday stroll. It can be solitary prayer. It can also be having a good time laughing with your friends. It can be contemplative stillness in the morning. It can be a glass of wine in the evening, just giving thanks over the day. So what is it that makes a practice spiritual? It's just this, that it connects the gift with the giver. And that tends to be a whole lot easier with things like Scripture and prayer and Sabbath. I mean, those are among the essentials, but the practices are powerless in and of themselves. All they do, the branch is useless unless it is connected to the vine. And so the power of the practices is only that they place you in proximity to God. And in that way, they open up your hands to receive his grace. A rule of life is a set of practices that hold you in that place of abiding. And it's not meant to feel strenuous or burdensome. Ideally, you won't even notice it until you find yourself beginning to drift away. And we all have those moments, the cultural currents that are beneath us, the changing wind of our circumstances. All those things are pushing us around, moving us around. And when that's for the good, like a good rule will have enough flexibility to help us bend toward the light. But when we are going off course, and usually that happens too slow for us to even notice that it's happening, a rule of life holds us to the vine so that we should begin to feel it when we find ourselves beginning to pull away. I love this image by the Anglican priest Margaret Ginther. She writes, "A rule does not need to be perfect or complete. Remember, it is a provisional document, neither a constricting garment we can outgrow, nor a rule book to be consulted anxiously before every move. Rather, I prefer to treat my rule of life as I treat my grocery list. I organize it meticulously, separating dairy from produce and baked goods from cleaning products. If I'm feeling especially fussy, I organize the menu according to the layout of the supermarket. Fruit and vegetables along the near wall, meat and poultry in the middle, dairy along the far wall. Every time I go to the grocery store, it's like I'm a hunter. I have no plan. Then I go off to the shop and leave the list on the kitchen counter. I already know what's in it." And that is the spirit of this. Jesus promises a yoke that is easy, a burden that is light. So if you would indulge me for just a moment, I want to ask you to do a little thought experiment. I want to ask you to close your eyes and get comfortable. Try to be in that, space in between falling asleep, but, just where you're comfortable. And we're going to do a little thought experiment. I want you to think of somebody that you admire the most. I'm thinking specifically of somebody that you actually know. Somebody who draws out goodness and beauty and joy in you. Someone whose presence seems to just bring the image of Jesus in you right out onto the surface. Now, what is it about that person? How do you feel when you're with them? What does their simple fact of their presence communicate to you? What does their life show you? Okay, stay there for a second. Now picture yourself at 80. Imagine yourself at some future point when you're thinking about the kind of life that you have led. Who do you want to be? What do you want people to experience about God when they are with you? What does God want to draw out of them through you, through your presence, through the way that you live your life? Those are exactly the kinds of questions that a rule of life is meant to put before you. Is the trajectory of, you guys can open your eyes. Is the trajectory of your life carrying you toward becoming that person, or is it just a few degrees off center, or is it way off center? Are you abiding in what will help you live that kind of life in the person of Jesus? And maybe a better question to ask is what is your current path producing in you? Because again, spiritual formation is not it's not neutral. Like, we're all being formed all the time. You are being formed for good, you are being formed for ill. Spiritual formation is just a fact of life. The only difference is that there is intentional spiritual formation and there is unintentional spiritual formation. And if you stop to think about it, we are largely defined by the small routines that make up our days and our lives. I love how the novelist Annie Dillard puts it. She writes, "How we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. What we do at this hour and that one is what we are doing. A schedule, or you could say a rule of life, defends us from chaos and whim. It is a net for catching days. It is a scaffolding on which a worker can stand and labor with both hands at sections of time." And so, to get back to something I said at the beginning of this series, you already have a rule of life that's shaping you. The question is, do you know what it is? And so I'm not suggesting you take on a new habit or a new practice. I'm just suggesting you take a little bit of attention and intention in those places where you might have been inattentive or unintentional. Because we all want to flourish, right? But we all find ourselves doing kinds of things that are just a distraction or a habit, right? I mean, every one of us means to be present with others. We want to have in our relationships that perfect blend of being wise and whimsical, and you know, every one of us is going to discover at the same time, somewhere down the road, that we have become a certain kind of person, a certain kind of friend, a certain kind of spouse, a certain kind of parent or student or friend or coworker. And we only become aware of the gap between where we intend to be and where we actually are if things don't work out as we had planned them to. And that is right where a rule of life lives, in that gap between intention and what is actual. There's a commencement address that David Brooks gave to the 2015 class of Dartmouth College, and in that, he said that he told this crowd of these Ivy League idealists that were about ready to take on the world, he told them to reject the conventional wisdom that the best course of action is to keep your options open. He said, actually, the thing that is going to be really important for you over the next 20, 30 years is to get really good at making commitments. Making commitments, he went on to say, sounds intimidating, but it's not. Making a commitment simply means falling in love with something and then building a structure of behavior around it that will carry you through when your love falters. And I think that's a pretty good description of a rule for life. It's like a wedding vow. So for the last 10 years of my life, I've tried to arrange around 3 simple things. What does abiding in Jesus look like for my family? What does it look like in my calling as a pastor? And then what structures of community do I need to make these 2 things possible? That's it. Those are the categories for my rule for life. Don't have to be yours, but that's just how I do it. And they're my way of drilling down to what are the primary commitments in my life. Because I knew then, when I started doing this 10 years ago, that my small kids would one day move out of the house. And I wasn't really going to be all that concerned about how my next sermon or the next class that I was teaching went. But I would do almost anything and trade almost anything to have another ball game with them or to have another night reading a book with them. So then how could I arrange my days to be in concert with who I want to be as a husband and as a father? And if I do that, I'm going to need a certain set of practices and commitments to ground me. Because left to my own, I will gravitate towards workaholism. That's just in me. I will do that. I will work myself to the bone. There's always another article to read. I mean, the internet is amazing, guys. Like there's no end to it. You can read scientific journals on, out-group social modalities. It's awesome. And I will do it unless I have something to pull me back to, being a human. And then I think about my calling as a pastor. I want to live as a life grounded in prayer and in study and listening well and lifting other people up and allowing them to flourish and use their gifts and their passions for the sake of others. So I knew I need to commit myself to a certain schedule and certain relational rhythms. And so when I started doing this, I hung my rule up in my office and I would look over it at the beginning of every week. And then after a while, it was like that grocery list. I didn't have to look at it to know what was on it. And it served me really well for a long time. And then 2020 happened. And, we moved here, and that part was great. But COVID happened right after that. And I realized that, I got to learn how to lead a church full of people I don't know and who don't know me. And I'm not as cool as the last guy, let's face it. And so I realized that the things that allow me to abide, the things that allow me to stay connected to the vine during those first 6 years of my time of doing that, when I first built my trellis, those things were good, but they were for a particular season in life, and I was going to need a new structure if I was going to make it in this next season of life. If Jesus was going to be, if I was going to abide in him over the long haul, I'd need to do some things differently. And so I took it apart. I kept some things that were the same. I put other things in, and I prayed through, God, what are you doing with me and in me and through me now? And how can I be responsive to that? And this is the thing I can't stress enough. In both seasons of those lives, I did not do this perfectly. My intentions will outpace my actions, to a remarkable degree. And I suspect I'm not alone in that. I mean, life is unpredictable, right? I did not take a class in seminary on how to leadership during a global pandemic. It just wasn't offered. Sometimes we get interrupted. You cannot plan your way into spiritual health. But what you can do is prioritize what are the most important things and allow the demands of life and work and the unpredictability of all that stuff to fit in around what the Spirit wants to do in you instead of brushing those things aside. And so this is not another thing to add onto your spiritual punch list. This is a deliberate, prayerful way of looking at what it is that you are already doing. So just a couple little bits of advice as a kind of round out this series for those of you who are going to take up the invitation. The first is this: if you take the time to craft a rule for life and you find that it's speeding you up and making you more irritable and more frantic, there is a good chance that was self-imposed and not Spirit-led. That's not the way that this is supposed to work. There is a real temptation to want to be over-ambitious, to set impossible goals and then fail at them. There's also a danger that a rule can be an end into itself, so that you end up serving the rule, get really good at like checking off the list of doing those kinds of things, and your spirituality ends up being joyless, life-denying, and self-centered. The goal is to abide in Jesus, not to be really good at doing things for Jesus. So focus more on subtraction than addition. Focus more on simplifying. Some of us are already too busy, right? And this is not just adding on one more thing to an already full life. It's about decluttering what is unnecessary to be attentive to what God is doing in you so you can focus on what really matters. So I don't keep it perfectly, but particularly in the challenging seasons, I have experienced God keeping me through these schedules and these practices. Because the result, Jesus says, of abiding in Him is joy. Finding joy in the life that you're currently living. It's not about coming up with a perfect spiritual plan to whip you into shape. It's not about willpower. It's about drawing out all of the goodness already present in your life, allowing you to connect with the Spirit in the place that God has you right now. And I think we need that more than ever. As I was rereading Junger's book that I referenced at the beginning, couldn't help but draw parallels between the men and women walking into the colonial wilderness to kind of escape the chaos and craziness of industrial life, and the desert mothers and fathers of the 3rd and 4th century who saw the Christian movement becoming more and more enmeshed with the aims and goals of the Roman Empire. The church was no longer getting into the empire was just getting into the church. And so they turned their backs on wealth and ease and all that life could offer in order to withdraw into the wilderness to live authentic lives of simplicity and prayer, guided by a common rule that bound their lives together and gave them a sense of purpose and direction. And they did that so they could serve as a holy contradiction of the culture around them. And I think that's what the world needs from the church. In his book, The Monastic Impulse, the theologian Walter Capps summarizes the legacy of monastic history in the West by stating that it is the West's most powerful and enduring example of counterculture. And when I first read that, when I think of counterculture, like my mind goes to, like I'm a child of the 80s, so it goes to punk rock, right? Spiky hair, chains, leather, all that cool stuff. Not nuns in a cloister. Like that's just not where my mind goes. But not only has monasticism endured longer, it's also been more powerful than any other form of resistance to mainstream society in the West. So if it's true, then the ones who are the true radicals are not the ones quoting Foucault and burning flags. They are the ones learning how to pray. G.K. Chesterton has this great line. It is the paradox of history that each generation is converted by the saints who contradict it most. So why a rule for life? Because the world needs holy contradictions to the idols of our time. And if you look under the hood of all the great spiritual renewal movements throughout history, you're going to discover again and again ordinary people radically caught up in a vision ordered by a way of living to ensure that they can live into that vision continuously. And to remain in Jesus requires intention, it requires means, it requires a community. And so this ancient practice of a rule for life is a way of living daily in those demands, those needs, those obligations, those opportunities of your life to live in step with the kingdom that is breaking into the world around you and the world inside of you. And so these last 8 weeks have just been an invitation to rediscover this ancient practice, to build the kind of trellis that will allow you to flourish on the vine, to be part of a community committed to the rule of faith and the rule of life, to take what we believe and put it into practice so that we can exist as an outpost of heaven in the world. And what we're dreaming of is not a community of people who retreat into the wilderness to escape the pressures and the hustle of modern life, but who live in the city under the rule of a different king, dancing to the tune of a different kingdom altogether. And friends, it is time to dream again. May it be so.